You are the bane of my existence. And the object of all my desires.
Maybe in one time.
I came here tonight because when you realize you want to spend the rest of your life with somebody, you want the rest of your life to start as soon as possible.
Standing in front of a boy, asking him to love her.
That's urgent like a motherfucker.
You have no idea what it is to be a woman.
Because I am female, I'm expected to aspire to marriage. I'm expected to make my life choices, always keeping in mind that marriage is the most important.
We'll be bored of him in 2 years, and we will be interested forever.
Although the romantic landscape is nearly unrecognizable compared to 300 years ago, one thing remains the same. Women continue to compete for male attention. In other words, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. That's right, I pass beginner French. As an avid consumer of film, I cannot help but be fascinated by our current and former literary interpretations of romantic relationships and what it says about us and society. I both wonder, how did we go from the age of the debutante and the Regency era to what we now call hookup culture? But also, how did we get from It Happened One Night and the original rom-com to the kissing booth and after? Is there a correlation there? Let's find out. Hi there, my name is Khadija, if you even care, and today we dive deep into the history of romance and its adherent literary interpretations. While romance and marriage are two inherently different things, romance was generated by a necessity of human beings who were innately desiring a family to find love and be able to procreate. It was a necessary vehicle that made marriage possible, the relationship, romance. And originally, marriage was used simply as a means for establishing alliances and securing fortune.
So don't sit there and tell me that marriage isn't an economic proposition, because it is.
Marriage is over 4,000 years old, with the first recorded marriage taking place in Mesopotamia in 2350 BCE. Marriage was about ensuring that a man was the biological father of his child. It was, quite frankly, about ownership of the woman. In ancient Greece, the father even said during the marriage ceremony, "I pledge my daughter for the purpose of producing legitimate heirs." Insane. In these ancient societies, men were free to take multiple wives, sleep freely with prostitutes, and, most appallingly, give back their wives if they did not produce them an heir. That's why the act of consummation was so important. Hi guys, I thought we'd try something a little bit different camera, different angle, different background. It's definitely not because I forgot to add some things, and I would never lie to you, okay? Without trust and honesty, we really have nothing between us, right? But I did want to add, have you ever heard some idiot man say, men are naturally hardwired to be more sexually promiscuous than women, it's biology? So that's actually not true. Men might be evolutionary designed to be polygamous. There's no precise scientific consensus on that, actually. It could really be either way, but the same is also just as likely for women, because while it might be advantage for a male member of any species to impregnate as many women as possible, we have evolved as a species to be primarily monogamous due to the benefits of a two-parent family and because of the importance of ensuring biological heritage. But also, in the wild, males compete for females because females are the limiting reagent. It's much more labor-intensive for a female in any pregnancy, as you know, than it is for the males, and they only need to have one mate, whereas males need to kind of keep trying until they can ensure true parentage. That's very much not the reality of our patriarchal society. So clearly things can change, but because of that, females of any species are also encouraged to mate with as many males as possible for genetic diversity. So it's declared that the patriarchal standards that belittle women are backed by science is a grossly oversimplified and unjustified opinion. Back to the video. However, still at the time, there was beginning to develop the notion of what it means to find your other half. and spend the rest of your life with them. The famous Greek and Roman philosophers theorized on this point constantly. In Plato's Symposium, there exists a fascinating paragraph that describes essentially the preliminary understanding of what we call the soulmate. It describes the concept of the rounded person, which in Greek mythology was a kind of person that existed way back when, a third gender essentially, that was split into two by Zeus, creating two separate souls who are now in persistent pursuit of each other. The symposium also speaks quite a bit on homosexuality, which was an interesting topic in ancient Greece, as some city-states supported it and others did not. But I hesitate to say that it took a liberal take on it because it does at one point claim that male homosexuality was holy simply because it did not involve a woman. So I would hate to hear what they have to say about female-female relationships. Men have been talking out the sides of their mouths for a very long time. Although we were developing concepts of love, marriage was still primarily viewed as a means of establishing legacy for men in particular. Women didn't get to have anything. But with the developing power of the Christian church, we just skipped a lot of history. I know, but this is the next relevant progression. I swear, I think of it as the Greeks, the Romans, early Christian era in which they chose to leave marriage up to the state, and now this. In the 8th century, the church began to perform ceremonies declaring that marriage was sacrament and endowed with God's grace. Different religions do have different views on marriage. In Islam, for instance, we have the idea of marriage as a legal contract. Back then, we had common law marriages in the 8th century when the church was just getting involved in all this, which were when people essentially said that they were married, which seems a lot simpler in my opinion. Now might be a good time to admit that I don't actually identify as a romantic. I'm not like you losers. Okay, my feet are firmly on the ground, and in the real world, marriage has always been used to control and belittle women, and now I'm expected to spend the rest of my life with a man? A man in my home? I can't think of anything worse than coming home after a long day at work and there's a man waiting for you. And I hate the idea that my children will have 50% of a man's DNA. It genuinely does keep me up at night. Back then, however, there were common law marriages, but by the end of the Middle Ages, it began to be a more formal process with public announcements and written contracts. Then, in the 18th century, people started to realize maybe they should put a bit more thought into who they were going to spend the rest of their lives with, and the wants and the needs of the bride and the groom finally kind of began to be considered. They began to be encouraged to make a, quote, love match and enter the age of the debutante. Now that we are moving out of this time where marriage was primarily for alliances and securing fortunes and making sure men had power, we moved into an era where, actually, now that I think of it, we weren't moving out of that, because during the Regency era, romance began to essentially be a performance of young women, parading them around in high society during the on-season as they eagerly searched for a husband in order to establish themselves in society. Marriage involved the church and a dowry that was paid to the man for the inconvenience of taking the bride off of the family's hands. And an intense season of event after event revolved around these young women securing a match. We've all seen it in Bridgerton, in Pride and Prejudice, the desperation of finding a man not necessarily to love, but to marry you in order to save yourself from ruin. To fall in love was considered lucky, and it's why these Regency-era shows, books, and movies romanticize such a concept of finding love in a world that didn't necessarily intend for it to happen. Yet these women, in love or not, were still beholden to the standard of securing legacies, alliances, and becoming things to be owned. There is a segment in the Bridgerton book, the one that's about Anthony Bridgerton and his love story with Kate, that really sticks with me because I think it really does emphasize something about the time. In the scene, he is about to, how do I put this delicately, consummate his marriage with Kate, but she's a bit scared and concerned. She doesn't want to do it on the night that they get married. And he says to her, and I quote, "I don't appreciate being denied my rights as a man and a husband." As if he has the right to her body. It's very telling. Women had to marry during this time, and they had to do so during their most fertile years. Otherwise, they were worth nothing. But nice gowns. Beautiful gowns. I love that online meme, and I have no idea of its actual validity. Do not quote me, I did not fact check this. But it references how during the Regency era, Women who were aged 23 to 26 and not yet married were called spinsters. 26 to 29 were thornbacks. 29 to 35 were Venus death traps. 35 to 40 were ladies of the blade. And 40 to 45 were the fanged dowagers. Which, in itself, the concept of the dowager is a reference to how, as a woman, all you were worth was the title of the man that you were married to, which was then passed on to your son, a son that you better have had. Which has always been fascinating to me, how human beings idolize ourselves for being distinguishable from the animals, yet we continue to reduce ourselves to these basic animal instincts, and that we primarily throughout history have overvalued the heterosexual nuclear family dynamic simply because it is more likely to produce children and further our survival. We demonize women who can't bear children because of whatever reason, yet we claim that the purpose of life is fulfillment and achievement. Yeah, okay. Bridgerton and Pride and Prejudice, both of which I am very familiar with. I will stand with you between the heavens and the earth. I will tell you where you are. Do you love me? I love you! From the moment I saw you trying to go over the wall, I've loved you desperately. I cannot breathe when you are not near. I love you, Charlotte. My heart calls out your name. Are both set during the Regency era. Bridgerton is based on the book series that follows the individual love stories of each member of the Bridgerton family, all 8 siblings who are named in alphabetical order, a prominent British family that is headed by Viscount Anthony Bridgerton. Each book corresponds to one sibling as they fall in love. Meanwhile, Pride and Prejudice, written by Jane Austen, follows the Bennet sisters, Jane and Elizabeth, as they both fall in love in unlikely ways. Both Pride and Prejudice and Bridgerton are underlined with very prominent themes about the wretched female experience during this time and how difficult it was for women to be completely denied freedom and independence and completely defined by their ability to marry and bear children. Daphne says this in a speech to her brother in season 1.
You have no idea what it is to be a woman. What it might feel like to have one's entire life reduced to a single moment. This is all I have been raised for. This is all I am. I have no other value.
Elizabeth's friend says this to her in a speech in Pride and Prejudice.
I'm 27 years old. I've no money and no prospects. I'm already a burden to my parents. And I'm frightened.
But the fact that our protagonists manage to find love and end up with men who are also very well off is simply the perfect situation for them. My question is, would it still be so good if these men were not so high up in society? It's okay if the answer is no. I'm not judging. I just want to know. Now that I think of it, I can't name a single romance story that does not have a well-to-do male love interest, regency or otherwise. Not saying it doesn't exist, but that it doesn't exist to me. Because these stories conveniently only show us the people in high society falling in love, we have a very romanticized idea of this time. But literally, what about everyone else? Essentially, these women are considered lucky to have found men who adore them, but also because they are now financially secure. And what is more romantic than money? I think the reason why this era is so adored, and the reason why I adore it too, is not because people and men in particular were actually more lovesick and adoring back then, but because we have imagined them to be. It's this far off past and this imagined fantasy that we can turn to whatever we want, but something that would be set right now in reality would probably have to contend with the constraints that we know to be real, and those aren't always ideal. Now, I might add, Pride and Prejudice is also considered the original enemies to lovers, spawning a trope that now looks very different in addition to many other common romance tropes that are now much less respected but do have roots in classical literature, but more on that later. But how did we go from this, a time in which women were paraded as cattle and romance was viewed as a social status, to now in which women are still paraded as cattle and romance is still a social status? This might be hard to believe, but the shift was not all that drastic. What I imagine is the most difficult for people to understand is how on earth did we go from a time in which a woman caught kissing a man would be ruined to now in which people hop from relationship to relationship, and it was quite literally women's rights. The Regency era was not good for us, actually. Under the English common law of coverture, which was also adopted in the US, women were legally controlled by their husband. They were considered under a single entity with their husband, that entity being the husband alone, and they could not own anything. They couldn't sell or purchase real estate or own their own personal property, execute a will, or even sue or be sued in their own name. They couldn't do anything without their husband's consent. This did begin to change. You see, in the US, Indigenous women actually had more rights than white women in the US within their own respective tribes. Mexican women were allowed to own and sell their own land, and so when the US government attempted to impose upon those rights after the Mexican-American War, they pushed back, as did other Indigenous women. Betsy Love, who was a Chickasaw woman, had inherited enslaved people from her parents, which boo, tomato, tomato, and I just can't believe that this is how the story starts, but I digress. She was married to a white man in Mississippi, and in 1831, he lost a court case. The court stepped in to take possession of all his personal properties, including Betsy's slaves, but she sued. And in 1837, the Mississippi ruled in her favor, which, to be clear, was her right to own human beings, claimed that she had a right to follow the customs that she was raised with, those being a woman having the right to own things. And 2 years later, Mississippi passed the first of a series of Married Women Property Acts that allowed women to retain property ownership even through marriage. The UK eventually followed suit. In the early 19th century, most women did not work, and those who did were likely unmarried. Black women were twice as likely to remain in the workforce after getting married than white women. Gender norms and expectations were strict. The expectations of the man and the wife and the romance were formidable. And film is more or less a living archive of all this. Old Hollywood portrays relationships more similarly to Regency era than what we have now. With the Hays Code, which was very strict about what intimacy could be shown on screen, relationships still seemed to be chaste. For instance, It Happened One Night, which is widely considered to be the original rom-com, one of the very first screwball comedies, and the first of only 3 movies to win a Grand Slam at the Oscars, that is, an Oscar for Best Picture, Actor, Actress, Best Directing, and Writing. In that movie, its most intimate scene is when Clark Gable lights a cigarette for Claudette Colbert. In fact, the actress Claudette Colbert originally refused to use her own legs for the scene in which she's baring her legs for a hitchhiking thing, but when they hired a leg stand-in, she essentially said, "You're not that girl," and chose to do it herself. The Hollywood Hays Code famously did not allow any intimate content, including kissing, adultery, or men and women being in bed together. The ridicule of religion or the portrayal of Christ, drugs, firearm, or crime in a glorious light, including sympathy for criminals, homosexuality in any capacity, or, my personal favorite, the use of the word damn. This code existed for 38 years, but this aligned pretty well with the chaste expectations of women and relationships at the time. Women were just starting to work at all, and we were just beginning to emerge out of the very limited Regency type limitations on intimacy. Eventually, in 1952, the Supreme Court ruled that films were protected under the First Amendment, and they simply had no way of knowing the monster that they were about to unleash on the world. I'm just joshing. I by no means think that we should be censoring such things. If I don't like it, I'm simply not going to watch it. The only thing I think we should be censoring is male podcast. But steadily, wars and industrialization, as well as the increased education of women, saw more and more women entering the workforce and for longer periods of time, in addition to the women's rights movement. In 1920, the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote in the US, and by 1930, 50% of single women and 12% of married women were in the labor force, rising to 40% for married women by 1970. Stigmas were beginning to change, and the legal barriers that forced married women out of the workplace also began to disappear. Women began to expect to work now, and they prepared for this within their own educational journeys. And this change in attitude was reflected in further women's rights. In 1974, women got the right to have credit without a male cosigner. The Pregnancy Discrimination Act was passed in 1978, and access to birth control increased and encouraged sexual liberty. Now, what did that all culminate into? Hookup culture, the unspoken rules of sex on college campuses, is an episode on the NPR Hidden Brain podcast where host Shankar Vedantam interviews author Lisa Wade. In it, Wade explains how hookups are essentially social currency, not too different from how marriage as a concept once was. But she also makes a very interesting point.
So part of the reason we see hookup culture on college campuses can be traced back to the sexual revolution and the women's movement. And the women's movement wanted two things for women, both sexually and otherwise. They wanted women to have the opportunity to do the things that men do and to embody masculine traits and interests. And they wanted everyone to sit up and notice that the things women had been doing all along and the traits and interests that they were believed to have were also valuable. And we really only got half of that.
We succeeded in putting women in male-dominated fields, kind of, but not in having femininity be celebrated and encouraged. We rewarded women for being masculine, the Rosie the Riveter archetype. And this resulted in women feeling particularly liberated to now behave in ways that a stereotypical man would. And men who were raised in a society that treats them as if they are the prize and forces women to compete for their attention, stereotypically have very little respect for the concept of romance if they are behaving in accordance with patriarchal standards. And many women have deeply internalized this. Enter the modern era. Now we see a twist on romance and love in film that is the tip of the spear, the culmination of all of this history. And there is no better way to trace this history than by looking at the development of modern-day romance tropes. Jane Austen can be credited for the initial development of the enemies to lovers trope and the second chances trope. Enemies to lovers was Pride and Prejudice, second chances was Persuasion. But it was Shakespeare who was largely credited with popularizing and mainstreaming the forbidden love trope with Romeo and Juliet, although he did take inspiration from Arthur Brooks' Italian novella The Tragical History of Romeo and Juliet. These pieces of writing were very much of their time, yet remain very popular today because of their ability to transcend time, or perhaps because of our inability to progress as a society. It is still a truth universally acknowledged that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. We are in a modern-day era of what Bell Hooks calls a loveless society. In All About Love, Bell Hooks also says that it's true that masses of men haven't even begun to look at the ways that patriarchy keeps them from knowing themselves, from being in touch with their feelings, from loving. To know love, men must be able to let go of the will to dominate. Our current era of love, romance, and relationships, what we call hookup culture, position us so that intimacy is less about love and more a status symbol, and moreover gives men undue control over such relationships. They are not encouraged under the patriarchy to experience love, but to use it as a tool to dominate. Meanwhile, women are convinced that we must be dominated in order to be useful and valid, as Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie said in her famous TED Talk. Now, marriage can be a source of joy and love and mutual support, but why do we teach girls to aspire to marriage and we don't teach boys the same? This is reflected in what the tropes have developed into today. Enemies to lovers and forbidden love often manifest as the bad boy and good girl trope, which in and of itself could be interpreted as an internalization of the male gaze with a passive woman and a dominant man, but it could also be a representation of the woman's innate desire to break out of restrictive gender norms. In A Doll's House, for instance, which shows a married woman essentially abandoning her children and husband because she decides that she simply can't take it anymore. She can't deal with the conformity. This wasn't what she ever wanted. Thank you so much to this comment from my last video that was about Wattpad that actually made the argument that I just gave and reshaped my opinion on it. They also asked to know more about the history of tropes, which is what this current section is inspired by. And ask and you shall receive, my babies. I mean, easy like that. I did try to do some research on the evolution of Wattpad tropes in particular, but it's actually very difficult to find anything about the inception of Wattpad, its beginning stories, and how they have evolved to what we have now. Wattpad did start in 2006, however, and the first stories that ended up making it off the website to the big leagues to actually being published, The Kissing Booth and My Life with the Walter Boys, were 2010 and 2011. So I'm just under the assumption that they really just hit the ground running with these insane kinds of romance stories from day one. Tropes evolved from being in the hands of men. However, remember, even with Jane Austen, she had to publish her books anonymously because women were not respected as writers, to romance now being entirely considered feminine for the most part. It's both kind of a good thing that reflects societal changes from a more rigid patriarchy to a less rigid one, but still it reflects how romance and love is considered to be something that women should strive for. Meanwhile, men can take it for granted. And these tropes themselves, those that have earned the moniker Wattpad in reference to the very popular fanfiction site, do tend to indicate that they are written by and for the women doing just that. Searching for male validation, looking at you, Colleen Hoover, and a lot of others. You guys aren't safe. I just haven't gotten around to you yet. Okay? Now I will not stop complaining about Colleen Hoover. I just think that she's irresponsible. She writes young adult fiction. These babies don't know any better. And let's not forget about the famous fanfiction that would incorporate modern celebrities into these written fantasies. Fanfiction actually originated in the 60s, according to The Guardian, with Star Trek, but it gets a bad rap because it's not considered to be original writing. It's also predominantly female dominated, as were a lot of the fan bases of the celebrities that fanfiction was being written about. So this was all occurring simultaneously. The emergence of the internet making this type of writing more accessible, the modern day celebrity emerging due to social media, and women becoming more comfortable entering these fields. And now we have 5 after movies. Wow. But let's discuss a popular modern day example of one of these tropes. In television, the love triangle. That's right, I am talking about Euphoria, which, perfect timing as we allegedly prepare for season 3. I really don't know what's going on with that show. And you know what? I keep telling myself I'm not going to watch the next season, but I know I'm going to be right there with the rest of you guys, judging and watching and complaining. If you aren't familiar with Euphoria, it is Sam Levinson's and Zendaya's HBO Max show, which follows a bunch of very disturbed high schoolers, and that's really the gist of it. The show also takes a lot of very interesting creative liberties, such as shooting on film and employing a lot of very interesting and fascinating costume and set design. It rapidly devolved after season 1, I would argue, primarily because it was a show in which its strengths lied in its romanticization and mythical interpretation of reality, and when it attempted to root that in a somewhat coherent plot, which was necessary to move out of season 1 into a different season, it kind of all fell apart. I hear a lot of people say that maybe season 1 was a fluke, especially considering Sam Levinson's other TV show, The Idol, but I think that the signs of that man's thinking were there all along. He is somewhat of a creative visionary, though, and so he can put things together in a pretty way. They just maybe are not the things that should be put together. You know? Let's talk about the famous season 2 love triangle. Maddie, Cassie, and Nate. Nate was Maddie's abuser, yet she was still in love with him and also kind of involved with him. And she and Cassie were best friends. Cassie knew all this, but she still deluded herself into thinking that this was somewhat okay, her hooking up with Nate. And Nate is, of course, the real villain here. He knew exactly what he was doing to both of them. It's a reflection of how the rules of the dating game have changed completely. There is now girl code and bro code and things that really did not exist back when monogamy was heavily encouraged and people were really only dating to marry. Remember, marriage was originally introduced to ensure monogamy and heritage. It all comes full circle. We developed societies that forced women to rely on men and therefore had to compete, but right now in the modern era, women are feeling more emboldened to be liberated in intimate relationships, and we are still in a position where women compete for male attention because we have been conditioned that way. This is why we now have the concept of the, quote, girl's girl, or the pick-me girl. Both terms that have been so horrendously over and misused that they have very little meaning now, but they do still say a lot about society, that there are different standards to accommodate our evolving times. Women are now in a position where we're not fully reliant on male attention for literal survival. We are now free to explore ourselves in these romantic settings, in these relationships. And that is what has led to the rise of hookup culture with those traces from previous time periods. There's also now a growing dependency on community over romance, leading to a sense of responsibility amongst women, the very same responsibility that led to the implementation of women's rights with the feminism movement in the first place. We began to realize that we were stronger together and we were intentionally being pit against each other, being forced to compete for male validation in order to undermine our own power, but we're still hitting barriers. A lot of that still exists today with hookup culture, with the quote, pick me girl, girl's girl. And a growing sense of loneliness and lack of community, especially amongst Gen Z. As that continues to worsen, we turn back to our romantic fantasies or intimacy as social currency and this idea of prioritizing romantic relationships over a sense of camaraderie. Hookup culture still as a whole inherently positions relationships as power struggles, social currency, and competition in order to sustain a system that has always been in existence. So has romance truly been lost? Maybe we never really got it right in the first place. I wanted to be mysterious and not like film an outro originally, but now it just looks silly. So thank you so much for watching this video. If you are still here, like, share, subscribe, leave a comment. I love hearing what you guys have to say about these things. As you can see, I love talking about all this. So thank you so much for being here, and I will see you next time.